Hello and welcome to the 97th episode of the Ancient Warfare
Ooh,
podcast. Yes, my name is Jas Boorthuis. I am the editor of Ancient Warfare magazine, and I'm here today with Lindsay Powell, Murray Dahm, Mark McCaffrey, and Mark DeSantis. It's a in-betweener episode, as we call them, and today we're going to discuss Alexander the Great in Afghanistan. I don't. I think it was suggested by one of our patrons. That's always good. Oh yeah, it was Jared. Thank you. And I think we'll just launch straight into the questions with Jared's first one because it is a nice introduction. Do you believe Alexander would have gone into the region had he not been pursuing Bessus? Mark, would you like to kick us off on that one?
yeah, sure. Of course, Alexander, after his initial invasion of Persia and the major battles that he encounters King Darius in terms of first at Issus and then at Gaugamela, after that, Darius falls from grace and, of course, is eventually overwhelmed by a number of his satraps from the east in particular, and particular Bessus, who takes on the mantle of the new, standing king as such, for a time taking Darius along with him, but again, later on, getting rid of him and actually leaving him famously by the side of the road for Alexander to pick up, half dead and dying. Now, Alexander, of course, when he took on Darius and beat him, he wanted, well, supposedly, to actually take on the mantle of the new great king. And to have that mantle, it would be, very useful for him propaganda-wise to actually have that handed to him on a plate by Darius in some, ceremony or whatnot. But of course, with that option being taken away from him, he then takes the high road and says, well, I'm going to be seeking out the murderers of my predecessor, and hopefully that will actually gain me just as much in terms of propaganda, and goes after Bessus. That draws him into Afghanistan. But on the other hand, Afghanistan had always been a significant part of the Persian East, and of course it plays a huge part in terms of being a bit of a borderlands, which can a firm borderland that the Persians could rely upon holding out the Scythians of the north and other tribes in the Indus Valley to the east. And of course, for Alexander to secure that seems a fairly logical step. I mean, it does take a lot of trouble and a lot of time, but if he's going to take on what had been the Persian Empire, then securing that northeastern corner seems to be fairly logical. But Alexander, being Alexander, won't stop there. He actually goes on and pushes that boundary further, and that possibly is what maybe causes more problems for him than perhaps if he would have just settled with what had been the Persian Empire. So, in terms of should he have gone there, I think, yes, he was going to go there no matter what, even if Bessus wouldn't have actually withdrawn there. It was always being in control of those warlords in that northeast corner, Bessus amongst them, Spitamanes, and whatnot, can't remember what's the word, Datafernes, I think it is, as well, who, in terms of these warlords in the northeast, having them on his side and securing that foundation on that border was always going to be important.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is, of course, when you look at Babylon, the how far east of Babylon the Persian Empire extends, and therefore taking Babylon, which is where he goes after the Battle of Gaugamela, is not even in the middle. It's there's more to the east of Babylon than there is to the west of Babylon in terms of the Persian Empire. So he is going to have to take those cities and that territory at some point. So in a way, the pretext of Bessus and Darius's flight give him a route to follow. But I mean, when you look at it, he goes from Babylon to Susa, then to Persepolis, then makes his way to Ecbatana and things like that. So he's covering all the bases in terms of going to the important cities of the Persian heartland, and then he begins his pursuit and ends up going into, Sogdia and Bactria, and into the Hindu Kush. Whereas the other territories that he ignores are the ones that don't have any agitating activity. Part of it's desert. They've got, the Gudrosian desert and things like that. But, the route of, bizarrely, he follows the route of most resistance, because that's where all these warlords and, the pretender to the throne are, which, as you say, Mark, he needs to defeat him in order to claim his, birthright, for lack of a better term.
Well, it gives you some indication of the importance of some of these warlords, that when you look at the major battles that he fights against Darius, that these warlords are taking up major positions, holding one wing at one stage, in terms of Bessus and Spitamenes. They're holding one wing. They're fairly significant characters in the overall Persian army. So that immediately should tell us something about, this is a significant part of the Persian Empire, not to be neglected.
Yeah. Do we know? Can we say anything about, say, the resources or in manpower or money, wealth that came from the area? What was it? Was it useful for him to have, other than strategic reasons or dynastic reasons?
I think it's not necessarily wealthy. It is wealthy, but he's captured Darius's royal treasury, which is 120,000 talents. I don't think money's the issue at that point. He can buy off, he can pay out his entire army, send most of it back home if they want to, rehire them with a bonus. So he's got cash to burn. I think it's more prestige, and I was saying
Blind ambition.
how. Sorry,
blind ambition.
Yeah, well, I was saying off air how so much of the earlier trends in Alexander's scholarship are cyclical. That Tan's Brotherhood of Man idea, which is in the sources, gets rejected by a generation of modern scholars, but then it resurfaces again. As modern scholarship changes its attitudes towards Alexander, and it's really interesting that this whole pursuit of conquering the Persian Empire and going beyond it, too far, because his army eventually mutinies, and that idea that he's making a better world is a really interesting one. Partly blind ambition, partly megalomania, but also to see that through, you have to follow where the path leads. You can't go, right, well, we've got to Babylon, we've got to Susa, job done. So it's a really interesting conundrum, I suppose.
And on that theme, the impression I'm forming from this discussion is you've got someone who is very driven, who wants to win, like a certain guy in this country, and winning becomes the approach to war. There's not very much of a strategy here.
I don't know if you're being tricked a little bit by the sources, though, as well. Thinking that, in terms of, we've got this massive, idea from the Greeks of Alexander's personality driving him forward all the time. But then you sort of got to think, hold on, well, it's not a Greek-based society up there. Later on, even the Greek colonists have a little bit of a hard time actually, adjusting to the style of life in that area. But there is the trade routes going through there. There's the later caravan routes going along the Silk Route through there as well. You've got that link from the, maybe the more established cultural centers of the Persian Empire to the more nomadic elements of the north, the Scythians and whatnot. And there's a lot of, there is life up there. And there's a lot of business up there. These warlords are powerful for a reason up in that area.
Yeah.
So
I think the other.
I read there's a lot of irrigation systems that they found traces of, which suggest that
Bactria.
Yeah, that there was a lot more urbanization going on that we might now think because of several thousand years of changes.
Yeah.
So it's
the
not
other thing,
just a barren terrain that we sort of picture when we think of the area now.
But I think they also, to this day, those areas and those cultures respect a powerful warlord. And therefore, to be respected in those areas and to control them, you need to be considered the most powerful warlord. So and the Alexander romance and the perpetuation of the stories of Alexander, which exist to this day, of communities who claim descent from Alexander, is such that he's incredibly successful at creating that persona and that image of the most powerful warlord who's defeated all of the other powerful warlords. Therefore, you need to be part of his empire. And I think it's also interesting that it's the easternmost satrapies that the successors lose first. That it doesn't take long for those to fall out of the empire of the successors of Alexander.
Well, already in the very start of the successor period, there's that split between the lower and the upper satrapies, and the idea that they're sort of on the edge of all this, of all the action as such. The sources sort of treat them as immediately as something separate, and even when you get the rebellion happening up there, the Greek mercenaries, it's at arm's length already. It seems to be a perception immediately that after Alexander dies.
Yep.
So we answer the question.
Yeah, we're just gonna. Yeah, I think we do, and I'm sure we'll get. Well, can we circle back to things? We do that constantly. There's a lot of questions here.
The reason I say that is because, for example, Mark raises a very good point, which is getting carried away with the sources, and most of the sources are written like 200, 300, 400 years later, aren't they?
Yeah.
So
well, you've got bits like Callimachus and Hieronymus and whatnot, but you're just sort of getting bits and pieces from them, and what we inherit from them sort of.
So that is a problem.
I mean,
just put it on the table.
Well, it's interesting because I think more than almost any other ancient source material, Plutarch and Arrian, even Quintus Curtius Rufus, name the contemporaries who were with Alexander as their sources. They use the historian who accompanied Alexander as their main source. Ptolemy was involved, and Ptolemy is one of Arrian's main sources, but there's philosophers involved, and there's all sorts of authors who they mention who were on the ground, which, it's quite remarkable how many of those we actually get named as the sources of. And it's funny because, of course, Arrian today is the most reliable of the Alexander historians to us, and yet Quintus Curtius Rufus and Diodorus Siculus, they have material that's very useful, but as historians in general, they are less regarded than Arrian is. And yet when you start to break it down, there's material in all three of those authors that isn't in the other two. So when you use Arrian, Diodorus, and Quintus together, they create a really rich picture.
And throw in the romances.
And I think there's material in all of them which has a kernel of truth. That
plus there's some
you can't necessarily recover the truth, but much of it's suggestive of a much more rich tapestry than a single source.
But being ancient warfare, how does the army do it? There's various questions here. The army had an amazing capacity to adapt. How they deal with the local tribes, pacify everything. Let's look into that. The practicalities of moving and fighting through Bactria and Sogdiana, what we call shorthand Afghanistan here today, but it's really about all the stands that there are in Central Asia.
Well, in this period, when Alexander moved into the region, the northeast frontier, the warfare changed very much from what had gone before. Not that Alexander hadn't fought relatively small-scale actions before, but the period of the great battles against a massive enemy army came to an end for several years until Hydaspes in 326. What characterized warfare in Afghanistan typically was small-scale raids, counterattacks, the need to defeat relatively small bands of enemy attackers and pacify a country that was up in arms against Alexander from the period largely from the building of Alexandria Escate when that was established. His passage through Bactria and Sogdia had been unremarkable, but it was when he got to the frontier of Sogdia with Scythia beyond the Jaxartes, what really made the difference was his establishment of Alexandria Scate at the modern Kogend. This was not a small garrison put in various out-of-the-way places. This was a large Greek settlement with a large population, and what it signified to the people of Sogdia, and why there was a rising very soon afterwards, was that this was going to control the frontier. What was now is it was not going to be a relatively permeable frontier between Sogdia and the Scythians, to whom they were related on the other side of the Jaxartes. It was actually going to become a hard border that would prevent the easy movement. And that's when this area erupted and forced Alexander to fight a pacification campaign that was very bloody, very long, and very frustrating. The point to be made is that he spent about 3 years in this area putting down whomever his enemies were, conducting various sieges of citadels and other fortified places, and it was exhausting. And we see in this period of time that Alexander's personality seems to get a little harder and crueler, and he's offing enemies, political enemies, such as Philotas, the son of Parmenio. And then once he's had Philotas executed, he has to have Parmenio executed. In a drunken rage, he kills Colitis the Black, who was a good friend of his beforehand, the satrap of Bactria. So what happens is that the stress of war, it gets to Alexander, and I think it gets to all of his officers too, in a very long and frustrating campaign. That's only ended apparently with after a long period of fighting and his marriage to Roxanne, who was the daughter of a local warlord too.
I think your labeling of this as pacification, though, is slightly off, because I think it is more terrorist campaign of Alexander against. I mean, you can say it's the local Bactrians and Sogdians reacting with their guerrilla warfare and being labelled themselves of terrorist activity against the invading Macedonians, but the Macedonians reply with horrific massacres of the populations in that area. And literally you're talking about settlements razed to the ground, and the army just let go. And of course Alexander isn't just going around there as one force. He is splitting up his forces under the command of, and this is it's a formative period for Alexander's army, because there are these generals coming through at this point who are really coming to the fore, who haven't really been sort of the up and coming men up until this point in his army, but they really take the fore now and actually set the ground for later successor period of the named figures, and they are being given individual commands, going on terror raids launched against local settlements. And then his first year in what we might term Afghanistan, roughly, it turns out to be anything but a success. And he realizes that he's going to have to commit men, time, effort, but ultimately crushing that population up there to actually gain some control over it. So it's brutal.
What's interesting there, though, is that that's the same tactic he employs on the east coast of the Mediterranean with much greater success. That if he crushes one city and says, if you don't surrender to me, this is the fate that will befall you, and it has a much cities start to welcome him and open their walls and their gates, and it doesn't work in Bactria and Sogdia, and I think that determined effort required to crush each piece of resistance is necessary, because each community turns around and says, no, we're not going to follow what happened, we're going to fight you. And I think that on the one hand, that's what leads to the increase in cruelty and the increase in brutality, and also therefore grinds down Alexander's personality and makes him more cruel. And whether he's driven to drink or not, it's hard to know. But at the same time, it also shows that Alexander, as a general, is willing to do that hard work. It isn't a matter of this tactic isn't working, I'm going to try something different. It is following through on no, this is the tactic. And I think the amazing thing from an organizational logistic perspective is that these are the same phalangites who we know from the three big battles, with Issus, Granicus, and Gaugamela, who operate in a 9,000 man strong phalanx. Suddenly, they are being used in terrain that is not suitable with weaponry. I'm not sure which source it comes from, but the idea that the sarissas get cut down in length so that they're sort of half-length sarissas, that they are now being used on small-scale raids in combination with light-armed aggreganes and Cretan archers and other sort of light-armed troops. This is not necessarily territory for cavalry, which is, again, Alexander is known as the general to lead these daring, dangerous cavalry charges to win battles in one fell swoop, which is what he does 3 times. This is a different type of warfare entirely, completely unglamorous. Sogdian Rock is really the only sort of battle that gets mentioned in this whole period between Gaugamela in 331 and Hydaspes in 326. And yet it's the warfare that Alexander is willing to undertake. And so the adaptability of Alexander and his troops is such that in later stages of warfare, especially in the successes and the Hellenistic period, the phalanx is incapable of that kind of warfare. That's not the kind of warfare that they are designed for, and it's not the kind of warfare they fight. But Alexander is able to use the resources that he's got and mold them to the warfare that's necessary, which is really remarkable in terms of Alexander's foresight and determination and abilities to use what he's got to fight what war needed to be fought. That's the word, yes.
Well, part of it is not warfare, it's actually more strategy in terms of him deciding that, okay, to start with, he decides that he's going to try and actually placate them and actually start placing in former Persian satraps, place them back in their positions and gain their loyalty that way. But he quickly realizes that actually the satraps in the northeast there are more than willing to say one thing one day and turn around 2 days later and say, no, we've actually changed our mind on that one. We're going the other way. And of course, he then has to work out, well, what is going to, it does end up being, occupation. It does end up being, can he actually prevent the rebellious forces up in the northeast from actually gaining supplies and gaining local support? And that's where, in the second and the third years of his occupation of Sogdiana and Bactria, he actually starts not bringing his forces back together at the end of a campaigning season, but rather placing them in their winter quarters amongst the local population to basically root out where the rebels are actually themselves spending their winters and actually convince the locals to give them up. And that's where he starts actually making some success. And then he can start turning around and actually thinking more about some negotiations again and gaining local loyalties, and eventually leading to him making that alliance with Oxyates to actually marry Roxana. He's thinking about strategy. It's totally different. And I think the perfect example of how much different this warfare is and this, what he's actually doing there is that at one stage you've got the description in Plutarch of Alexander taking down one of the enemy warlords himself, not in single combat, sword to sword, spear to spear, but actually is at the end of a bow. So it's totally vastly different to what we've seen go before.
You do see some adaptations, I think. Didn't he raise a unit of javelin cavalry before this campaign? And it seems like he constantly changes the makeup of at least his armies per mission. It's like for a certain mission, it's almost always the light infantry and the light cavalry, and the exact combinations change around depending on what they have to do. So it seems like he is capable, certainly, of making those adaptations on a more tactical level, depending on what he expects the army to have to do.
tactically, he
Yeah.
displayed remarkable acumen in the Battle of the Jaxartes against the Scythians, where the Scythians are very mobile horsemen, small corps of armored cavalry, but mainly at this time horse archers, and it's a defended river crossing. The Scythians are waiting on the far bank of the Jaxartes, and Alexander has to get across. So, in order to provide the space for his troops to go over, he uses artillery to cover them. They go over, but Alexander cleverly uses the first soldiers that he puts on the other side as a lure to bring the Scythians in, who of course come in, swarm around them. But then he sends his own cavalry around to, and it being engulfed and surrounded by horse archers is a typical thing that happens between a mostly infantry army when fighting a mobile horse-based army. But then Alexander sends his own cavalry across the river to surround the Scythians. So he trapped them, knowing what their own tactics would be. And I find that to be one of the true displays of Alexander's brilliance during his entire career.
But again, we've got that great focus on Alexander's success and his brilliance and whatnot, but we've also got we've got the worst defeat that Alexander's forces actually suffered up near Maracanda. That, when he's actually sending these deputies off with their, various different unit sizes and whatnot, there are a number of, evident defeats and setbacks. And in the sources, they sort of tell that he is actually having to go and mop up these things. And of course, you've already mentioned the famous death of Colitis, where actually probably some of the anger that was being raised on that occasion is to do with the fact that actually Alexander's sort of starting to become very full of himself in terms of his importance to things, maybe, as opposed to when he sends out his generals and actually how much he can rely on them. He actually gets one of his, we've mentioned that he's got various different people in his campaign army. He's got one poet who he actually allows to perform a farce about this defeat at Maracanda before the court one night. So this is part of the change in his personality. He's coming through these experiences, and it'd be wonderful if we knew more about them. But unfortunately, our sources focus on him.
Yeah, and of course, in the sources, there's while he goes into Afghanistan, I mean, the whole reason is dynastic policies, and the thread you alluded to before about, is this about mixing the Macedonians and the Persians? Are we looking at taking over adopting local customs, figuring out how his army is going to respond to doing so? Is it a tactic to placate the local population? All these things are sort of mixed together, which makes the focus very much on Alexander and his entourage instead of how does the whole army interact with its surroundings, which is also what most of the questions are about.
I just wanted to point out exactly how amazing it is how many of Alexander's battles are defended river crossings. That there's at least 4 of his major battles that we talk about today are defended river crossings, which again is not the battlefield we necessarily bring to mind when we think of the Alexandrian and the Hellenistic phalanx, and yet that's the battles that they fought and were successful in for the most part. That was it.
So we mentioned garrisons already. Mark did for a sec. I think we read constantly that they leave quite substantial sized units everywhere, don't they? Plus, he founds all these cities all the time. Is that all just about controlling the territory, you think?
I think it did two things. I think one, it was a form of control over the surrounding territory, that you had trained soldiers in an area, but it was also very useful for removing either old or wounded, any sort of soldiers that maybe not have been up to the task anymore. You wouldn't have considered them perhaps frontline fighters, but they would have been useful as garrison troops. A little bit of Greek Macedonian culture, an island in a particular area, that would be able to form a base for friendly soldiers in a particular region. And I think that we keep read again and again how he would essentially put soldiers, settle them in various places as he marched. And I think that it was a twofold reason, at least, that made a lot of sense, I think, to Alexander. That is, some soldiers would have to be left behind, but not abandoned, that they would be put somewhere, have their own Greek-style city, and also control the territory around them, and protect his own lines of communication back to other parts of the empire, and ultimately to Greece.
So I think as a derivative of that is also the logistics, supply chain. I mean, you've got him pushing his lines out further and further, and he can only really do that knowing that he can rely on the supplies of goods and men. I mean, at some point the men come through as well. And in a sense, you can say that by having those self-sufficient communities, they can act as warehouses. They can actually contain supplies and that sort of thing. But you can also fall back to them if you need to. So in fact, it's a defendable position along your supply chain.
But in this case, you've got more here in the area of Bactria and Sogdiana than anywhere else in his empire. There's like I've got a stat here of 46% of all men who he leaves behind in a garrison position are left in Sogdiana and Bactria. And that's considering how far he's come from all the way from Macedon across the old Empire of Persia, and what he then goes on and leaves in later on in India and down in the south. That's a whopping big number, and it's not just for a supply line, or he needs to actually put that influence in there. But there's another thing that was mentioned in a book by a guy called Frank Holt, who pointed out that it's interesting that you've got, at the time that he's in Bactria and Sogdiana, it's at the same time that you get Antipater back in Greece, has just crushed the rebellion in Greece, and at the end of that, sends off a large detachment of reinforcements for Alexander's army, which contains a huge number of Greek mercenaries, who are then taken to meet up with him in Bactria and Sogdiana. And then you have a huge number of Greek mercenaries left there. And the point that he raises is actually possibly this is a way of actually taking a troublesome element from one side of his empire and placing it in somewhere that he finds it's going to be useful. And
they're dependent on him. It's
they're
Babylonian.
Yeah.
So it's
I think
there's lots of reasons here.
I think two things. One is Alexander has always been leaving garrisons behind. So in 333, he gets 3,000 Greek Macedonian reinforcements who have been trained as phalangites. Now, they don't become new divisions of the phalanx. They are absorbed into the existing 6 divisions of the phalanx, the taxes. So we can assume that therefore the 3,000 men that are replaced, because they're the casualty numbers he's suffered are in the hundreds, not any vast number. So in his trip through Turkey and down the east coast of the Mediterranean, he's placed 3,000 of his men in garrison in those towns, and they're then replaced by these reinforcements. So I think it's something that's always happened, which comes back to your point, Lindsay, about a logistics chain and also a fallback position and all of those things. But also to Jasper's point, that Alexander is adaptable, that these regions of Sogdia and Bactria need bigger garrisons, probably based on how hard they were to take and how determined the resistance was, so that the garrison towns get a larger proportion of troops because they're a harder town to garrison. Whereas, you know, the towns further west and on the Eastern Mediterranean, those ones might not necessarily need large garrisons at all. So I think that's not just say, here's a garrison. It's very much this needs a bigger garrison, this needs a smaller garrison. And we don't know the exact specifics of each garrison, how many men. You know, you might say that a syntagma 256 men would be a standard garrison, but we don't know. But, you know, if you're detaching 256 men per town, minimum or whatever, who knows?
So here's a couple of gimmies. Somebody asked, what is Alexander the Great's connection with the city of Kandahar in southeastern Afghanistan?
Kandahar is one of the Alexandrias. Is Kandahar? It is derivative.
Yeah.
It's derivative of I think the Arabic phrasing of the name eventually. But yeah, one of the 23 supposed cities, although probably most of them were already well-established settlements before he came along, and it was just his repurposing of them, which led to the renaming of them.
Thank you.
Great
That
optics.
you
Great
just
optics.
answered another question. Somebody also, the same Richard also asked, do we know if there's any relation to Alexander the Great or the city of Gardez in eastern Afghanistan? I actually looked that up, and it says that there were Greek finds there, but we know very little about that city.
I'm sure someone will find his tomb there at some point soon to promote.
That would be a dragging it all the way there. We should come back a little bit to the logistics, because we have several questions. We talked about the cities as helpful in the logistics chain, but we actually, of course, at least looking back behind me, interestingly, I realized Donald W. Engels's book on the logistics of Alexander the Great is from 1978, which is, of course, a year before the Russian invasion, or the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So some of the things he reports, he goes back to old British surveys from the 19th century. But he's made a very careful analysis of how far the army marches, how big the army is at any time. And logistically, it looks like shoestring is a pretty good description of much of the maneuvering.
Let me ask you, how much of his army would have been foraging? I mean, did it bring a lot of its own supplies with it, or did it just
the army was supposedly capable of, every soldier was supposed to be capable of carrying supplies for 14 days, but you have to start getting them somewhere.
Yeah.
And the size of the estimates of the size of the army he takes into Afghanistan, that runs in the many tens of thousands.
But you very quickly hear about him having, building a supply chain, or actually inheriting the supply chain of the former Persian regime. Yeah. And you hear about, satrapies like Drangiana later on providing for when he comes back across the Gedrosian desert. And you hear about the supplies being coordinated, brought in from the different central satrapies. So it seems something that is, it's there, and he's thinking about it, and it's in action. But at the same time, you do hear about the hardships of them, the troops suffering from both cold and hunger whilst they're on the Afghan conquest.
I was going to add, Engels also seems to add. He looks very carefully at the timing of the various maneuvers, which seem to be timed with the grain harvest in various areas, depending on, some of the mountain valleys have a harvest that's much later in the year than the more open plain areas.
Hence, you get him leaving leaves on one of his campaigns, the start of the campaign in 327. And he's said to have left a week early, or in the analyst's point of view from the ancient sources. and runs into bad weather and lack of supplies at that point.
Yeah.
So, local knowledge is not, is lacking with him there.
It's what it'll depend on, of course. Yeah, it seems to be, again, some of the more fertile areas that are good for lodging the army for a while, building up supplies, and then they just go for a stretch until the supplies last or not, and then there go the pack animals and anything like that.
At one stage, there's a description of his army eating the pack animals, and being forced, into that. But at the same time, is it the supply chain that's failed him, or is it Alexander being Alexander and pushing his troops to the nth degree? There's one reaction where he marches back to Marikanda and does 180 miles in 3 days with part of his army, and he pushes his troops to the nth degree. So
that's clear. Let's see, what do we have left? The most difficult question for us probably is what could modern military efforts by Russia and the U.S. to occupy the country learn from Alexander and his time in Afghanistan?
I think we've already covered part of that in terms of saying that the thing that he does that none of them do is that he leaves a huge occupation force behind him.
Yeah.
And
that say wholesale slaughter, but
wholesale slaughter as well at the same time. But his solution in the end is leave huge amounts of his own men there, which no forces are going to do today.
Yeah, and I think like the British in the 19th century, the simple answer is don't. So
don't
well,
try.
I think there's another dimension to this as well. I mean, if I can catch it like this, I mean, a modern army does not go in with a conquering strategy mentality. It's couched in terms of peacekeeping or kicking out terrorists and democratizing and all the other scope creep elements that come into the policy. But my impression is that if you're looking at Alexander, it is an attempt to actually take and acquire that land for his purposes. So there's not peacekeeping and that sort of thing in part of his strategy.
But it is to start with in terms of he putting, taking some of the former Persian satraps and saying, right, I've beaten you, but now I'll put you back in that position. So he is sort of trying to sort of reestablish a local command there at first, and then realizes that just isn't going to work. And in the end, he does have to leave Macedonian and Greek commanders there to be in charge. In the end, Amyntas takes over, mainly because Colitis, of course, his reaction is, no way in hell I'm staying here. This is a death trap for a Macedonian command to be left in. But yeah.
So I think that the moral to the story to modern commanders is don't come here. You have no means to succeed. The various attempts have been tried before and none of them worked.
Well, there's kind of a downer to end on.
No, but that's the realpolitik, isn't it? Of the
it is.
It geography.
Well, look at what happened.
2,000-year-old lesson we refuse to learn.
Look what happened with the Americans. As soon as they start trying to say, right, we're going to have an exit strategy. And of course, look at what Alexander's exit strategy was. He left huge numbers of his own men there. He tried the local, we'll bribe them, we'll make our local links, we'll leave some of their own, in charge and whatnot. That doesn't quite work. We're going to have to leave some of our own men there. Don't worry, we've secured the north. We're going to then take care of the eastern frontier. We're going to head to India because that's where some of the, our rebel enemies have fled to, and they're going to come back if we don't take India as well. He heads towards the east, takes India, but of course, he ends up having to turn around and say, right, I'm going to send a whole unit back to Afghanistan because I've just heard that they've rebelled against me again. So it's
No, but I like Murray's point. It's was it you said a 5,000 year or 3,000 year lesson we're not prepared to learn, and I think sometimes this is where history really does have to be read and understood and learned from.
That's a good one to end on. Anybody has anything to add?
Can't follow that.
If not, we'll say thank you very much. We'll see you in a month.